All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're deconstructing a really powerful and, frankly, pretty stark strategic doctrine for a hypothetical second Trump term. This all comes from a Substack article, and we're going to unpack the potent metaphors and the step by step plan it describes for, well, fundamentally remaking the state. And yeah, right from the start, the source material pulls no punches. This one quote sets the entire tone. The argument we're about to explore isn't framed as, a gentle course correction or a couple of policy tweaks. No, it's presented as a radical, surgical procedure. So here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll kick things off with the diagnosis, take a look back at the first term, and then really dissect the strategy for a second one, including its main target. We'll get into how the government is described as being at war with itself before we land on that final, pretty dramatic conclusion. Okay, so let's start with the core metaphor that holds this entire strategy together. The source frames the current political situation not as some problem to be managed, but as a critical condition that requires a really drastic intervention. The argument being made here is that the time for small, conservative measures is just over. A potential second term is framed as that exact moment of decision, when you stop trying to treat the symptoms and you decide you have to cut out the disease itself. Now, to really get the logic behind this proposed surgery, the author first has to give a diagnosis of what went wrong the first time around. And the first term is presented not as a success, but as a failed treatment that actually made the underlying condition worse. The imagery in this quote is pretty vivid. The source argues the first term was disruptive, it was loud, it was chaotic, kicking over tables, but it didn't fundamentally change the power structure. It left the choir, as they put it, completely untouched. And here you can really see the proposed shift in strategy. The first term is framed as all improv and chaos. The second is seen as methodical and destructive. The goal isn't just to make noise anymore, it's to make sure, quote, the desks are empty. So the author presents this kind of fool me once theory. The first try was a revolution, tons of energy, but no real plan to hold the territory. The second is envisioned as an occupation, a deliberate, systematic effort to actually control the machinery of government. So what does this occupation actually look like? Well, according to the source, this scorched earth doctrine translates that whole surgical metaphor into some very, very direct administrative action. The plan, as it's laid out, is a four-pronged purge. We're talking mass terminations in key departments like the DOJ and state, forced retirements for career officials, cutting loose federal contractors, and, this is a big one, zeroing out the budgets for NGOs and other outside groups. But this whole purge isn't supposed to be random. It has a very specific conceptual target, and the author gives it a name, the intercom. It's presented as the central nervous system of the opposition. Okay, so what is the intercom? Well, as the source defines it, it's this huge, interconnected web of institutions. Think nonprofits, media outlets, even parts of the government itself, that are all seen as working together to promote a single ideology, often with taxpayer money. And dismantling it means taking these very practical steps. It's all about, in the author's words, cutting off the oxygen. That means defunding everything from foreign aid and public media to cultural programs and advocacy groups that are perceived to be part of this network. So this strategy leads to a scenario the author describes as absurdist theater, a government that looks like it's openly fighting with itself. And the source uses a really specific anecdote to illustrate this whole paradox. So let's look at this key study. It all centers on one government employee, whose actions are presented as a symbol of this very internal conflict. I mean, this sequence of events described here is pretty extraordinary. You have a DOJ lawyer protesting his own administration, confronting federal agents, and then being charged and fired by the very department that employs him. It's literally the state acting against itself. And this quote it captures the essence of it perfectly. The Ouroboros, right? That ancient symbol of a snake eating its own tail. It's being used here to describe a government that has turned inward, attacking and labeling itself in this endless cycle of internal conflict. So, what's the justification for a purge like this? Well, from the perspective laid out in the article, individuals like Sean Dunn aren't seen as dissenters. They're seen as moles, agents working inside the government to subvert it from within. And all of this brings us full circle, right back to that initial, stark medical metaphor, and the ultimate reason for such a radical approach. After laying out the diagnosis, the failed first attempt, and the scorched earth tactics, the source gets to the final question: why? Why go to such extremes? What's the end goal here? The answer provided is unflinching. The whole procedure is described as surgery with no anesthesia. The justification is all about speed and decisiveness, to perform the amputation so quickly that the system just doesn't have time to react. And what's really essential to understand is that, from the viewpoint being described, this isn't some new war. It's framed simply as finishing a job that was started but left undone during the first term. And this right here reveals the direct line of causation in the argument. The failure to be decisive in the first term, the author argues, is what allowed the rot to spread, to metastasize. And that's why this radical amputation is now presented as the only option left. And so this explainer leaves us with a final, really provocative question. This entire doctrine is focused on the act of removal, of cutting something out, and it forces us to consider the aftermath. After the surgery is done, what comes next? What's built in the space that's been cleared?